It's always the extremes that grab our attention. I actually know very little about the musician Lady Gaga, but I do know that she once wore a dress made entirely out of raw meat to an award show. And if I told you right now to picture Vladimir Putin, how many of you are picturing him riding on a horse, bare-chested? It's always the extremes that grab our attention. In fashion and art, in politics and entertainment, extremes grab our attention because they make us question the norm. There's some extreme texts in Judaism that have this power to cajole us, to make us question. The texts, they give improbable, absurd, and even ludicrous scenarios. They exist to give us insight into ourselves in a way that the familiar cannot. Because sometimes we have to step outside to look back in. So tonight, I want us to dig into one of these outlier texts to see what the extremes can teach us about the norms that we hold. So there's a section of Talmud that dictates our obligations to the poor. And the rabbis offer in this section that should a man from a noble and a wealthy family become poor, the community is obligated to preserve his dignity by maintaining his previous lifestyle, up to and including a horse for him to ride upon and a servant to run in front of him. A what? You're telling me that I, with my Jewish tax money designated for the poor, that I have to pay for some formerly rich guy to have a horse and a servant so that he can continue to feel superior to me? That's ludicrous. And what's more is that a story follows about the great Rabbi Hillel. Hillel, in a situation like this, not only got the guy a horse, but when he could not find a servant to run in front of him, Hillel did it himself, running in front of this once rich guy for about 2 miles. That is not a short distance for an old rabbi. The great rabbi himself was willing to run in front of this formerly rich man as his servant. The rabbis want to make a point. They intentionally use this extreme example to drive home an unexpected idea. You may think that tzedakah is about meeting basic human needs, but you're wrong. It's not. Tzedakah is actually about human dignity. For a rich person who has gotten used to a certain way of living for many years, taking away that standard is hard. It doesn't matter if it's a privilege that not everyone else had. The rabbis recognize that adjusting to a new reality feels to them like being stripped of one's dignity. And the person going through that adjustment deserves our compassion. Their dignity matters. Now, on a theoretical level, I understood this text. I understand the value that it's trying to convey. But on a gut level, I didn't really get it. I didn't really get it until the Me Too movement swept our country last year. As a woman, I experienced Me Too as a kind of liberation. This movement has brought to light the breadth, depth, and pervasiveness of harassment, abuse, and double standards against women. It finally created a space for me to have my experiences heard and taken seriously. I no longer had to hide the indignities that I have carried as a professional woman. The harassment, the multiple indecent propositions from mentors and professors, and even a death threat that I received while working here at Temple Emanuel from a man posing as a prospective congregant. When he overstepped boundaries, I stopped communication, and he wrote me a text as follows: "Warning, whore. I know where you stay, and I will bust your head into the kitchen countertop to teach you how to respect men. Watch your back. I'll be watching you." I was too scared to sleep in my own home for 2 days. Me Too enabled me to share how these and other experiences compounded one on top of the other. Me Too made me feel less alone. Me Too made me feel like maybe, just maybe, it wasn't my fault that these things kept happening, that I wasn't somehow inviting these behaviors, that something was wrong, and that it wasn't me. Now, most of the women in my life found themselves in the midst of a long-awaited catharsis. But as I was experiencing a catharsis, I noticed that many of the men in my life were becoming increasingly nervous. For many men, the Me Too movement was shocking. They were shocked at the depth, breadth, and number of stories from women. They were shocked at the cascade of careers and reputations crumbling for offenses going decades back. And for some men, it is also true that they experienced the Me Too movement with relief of their own, able to share their own stories of harassment and assault. Mostly, though, I watched men in my life, good men, start to mentally scour their dating and work history, wondering whether past actions may come back to haunt them. Did she have a drink too many? Did she take the joke the wrong way at the lunch meeting? That Me Too movement has given men insight into how actions they may have perceived of as innocuous or benevolent, how those actions may have actually been received negatively. Me Too has, as one congregant put it, changed the rules in the middle of the game on men. The rules are changing on men. What society expects and how they talk to, work with, and relate to women. And it's changing for all men, not just the predators making the Me Too headlines. The extreme behaviors of Harvey Weinstein and the like have forced us to question our norms about what we have considered acceptable, or at least what we have tolerated. We have learned that something in our culture was broken enough to allow for these abuses. Something tolerated, excused, enabled, and perpetuated these extreme behaviors. Locker room talk and jokes may seem harmless enough, but those locker room talk and jokes can be used by some to excuse catcalling. Catcalling can be used by some to excuse groping. And groping can be used by some to excuse assault. Now, very few men will actually physically assault women, but those who do are empowered by a culture that has casually and pervasively objectified and dismissed women. It used to be that men didn't really have to think about the way that their gender shaped their actions in the public sphere. Now they do. Now women, for the most part, we have been painfully aware of this for our adult lives. Hyper aware of what we wear, where we walk, who we're with, what we say, how we say it, and what we don't say. And now men suddenly find themselves in the same place as women. that they have to think with much greater care about how their actions will be received. And that shift is really hard. Now I get what the rabbis are talking about in the Talmud with that formerly rich guy and giving him a horse. I understand why he was given these things from the community's tzedakah, because it's almost impossible to force somebody to immediately adjust to a new reality, even if that reality is totally normal for others. On Yom Kippur, we collectively take responsibility for our transgressions, bizadon ubishkaga, both the intentional and the unintentional. Tonight, we sit here with yet another scandal consuming our national discourse, and with scandals rocking the Jewish world as well. And we are forced to face that we are responsible for a broken culture. I understand the fear that men must have in this moment of transition, out of a desire both to get it right, to do right, and out of a fear of what happens to them if they get it wrong. But as difficult as this moment of cultural transformation is, it is a mistake to think of it only as a loss for men, a loss of power, of status, or of privilege. Go back to that story about Hillel running in front of that once rich guy. Hillel does this to ease his transition to a new reality. It's an important act to affirm that formerly rich man's dignity, to let him know that he is not going through this alone. But it's also important to note that after about 2 miles, Hillel stops. He stops running in front of the man on the horse. Now, the Talmud does not say what happens next, but here's what I imagine. I imagine that the man got down from the horse. He gave up the trappings of the life that he once lived, and he walked with Hillel. Yes, the nobleman gave something up, but he gained something so much more valuable. I mean, just think about what he learned walking side by side with one of the most revered rabbis of all time. Think about the perspective he gained walking on the ground, actually meeting with and interacting with people, not riding above them. And so it could be for the Me Too movement for men. So it should be for men in the aftermath of the movement. Yes, men will have to be more conscious of their deeds and their words to help build a culture that doesn't diminish women. But all of us benefit from a greater awareness of how the expectations we have placed on men and women, how they have harmed us. Because the culture that enabled abuse named by the Me Too movement, it hasn't only harmed women, it has harmed men. The expectations on men of emotional stoicism and self-reliance, strength, machismo, and dominance, all those things that fuel toxic interactions with women, they take their toll on men too. Our culture expects men to be unemotional, not to need support, to handle it on their own. Men are taught to swallow it down and bottle it up. It's no wonder that we have an epidemic of loneliness among men. Isolation has become such a significant health threat in our country that middle-aged men suffer a suicide rate nearly 3 times that of women. The culture that led to the Me Too movement, it harms women, but it harms men too. It harms men who want to ask for help but feel like they can't. It harms men who are victims of domestic violence but feel ashamed to speak out. It harms men who prioritize family over work by challenging their masculinity. And it harms men who share real emotion and are then viewed as weak. If we are truly going to own our responsibility for one another, we are going to have to work through this muck together. We will have to treat each other not as adversaries, but as allies in building a healthier culture in our families, in our schools, in our workplaces, on our dating apps, and yes, in our religious institutions too. We are not immune from the toxic fumes of our larger culture just because we're progressive Jews. Tomorrow, at our Yom Kippur afternoon forum, we will explore what this is actually going to look like with the founders of the Good Men Project. It's an online forum that supports healthy identities and relationships for men. And from there, Temple Emanuel will have a learning group, a small task force of men and women to determine the transformations we want to make in our own community and what we teach our kids, in our policies, and at our events. So if you want to be part of this intentional cultural transformation, talk to me, email me, call me, join me and the task force. Because we have a collective choice in how we respond to stories of abuse revealed by the Me Too movement. We can dismiss them as extremes, as something that has nothing to teach us because we would never fill in the blank. Or we can use this cultural moment to hold a mirror up to ourselves and ask, how are we responsible and how can we do better? If you feel paralyzed about how to start building a healthier culture, the first step is simply to ask when you are unsure. Building a healthier culture will take a lot of listening. Do you like when I compliment your clothes? Or does it make you feel uncomfortable? How do you feel when somebody does X? What has your experience been with these issues? Listening without judgment to our experiences and our fears. As men, as women, as gender fluid, as people. Not to make suggestions, but to understand. We need to ask more and assume less. And when somebody speaks to us, to ask us to change a behavior, even something well-intended, what if we didn't respond with defensiveness, but with, I'm sorry. What can I do differently? What a blessing that would be, to have our world opened up to new perspectives. If we take a page out of Hillel's playbook to step forward in this moment of transition, to be allies, not adversaries, in building a healthier culture, to not just understand, but to know in our guts that we really are responsible for each other. Gamar Chatima Tova.